As I sat in my 8th grade English class one morning, the boy who sat in the aisle to my left and one seat in front of me, he turned to me and he passed me a note, which was unusual because I really didn't know him very well. So I took the note, curious, and I unfolded it, and as I read the note, this is what I saw. Jim, I am from another planet. I thought you should know. Wow, that was different. I wondered what this could possibly mean. Now, on the one hand, such an outlandish proclamation was somewhat interesting to me because you see, I was super interested in science. You might call me a science nerd, and so were most of my friends. And I also really very much enjoyed science fiction. My very favorite television show was Star Trek, which actually started me on my interest toward science. So much so that through the years, my friends who came to know me and saw all the lessons that I gleaned from Star Trek, they gave me little trinkets to show that they really understood me. So for example, I have my handy dandy Star Trek communicator. I have my Next Generation comm badge. I have a Star Trek Enterprise NCC 1701 model, and over my door behind me, I don't know if you can see it, my staff at the agency where I worked gave me a little plaque that said Captain's Quarters that I hung over my office door. So at that age, in 8th grade, receiving this announcement was both strange and somewhat exciting. What was I to think about it? Well, the boy's name was Thurston Oliver Howell IV. Now, obviously, that's not his real name. For confidentiality purposes, I certainly wouldn't want to give his real name. But one of the first things I did when we left class is I engaged him in conversation, because you see, with great claims come a great responsibility to provide the proof or the evidence that your claims are actually true. And so one of the first things I started doing, since I knew more about science than most people that I knew of in the school, and so the first thing I started doing was asking him questions about astronomy. And much to my surprise, he actually seemed to have the answers. So I began asking him about physics. Oddly, he seemed to know the answers to those too. I asked him about space travel, and he had those answers. And I asked him about his spaceship, which he had, for my knowledge at the time, plausible answers. He explained the photon drive of their mothership. He talked about using gravitons and electromagnetic anti-gravity devices for his ship that happened to be in his garage, which of course he couldn't produce. He lived too far away from me and we didn't have cell phones at the time. So I peppered him with all kinds of questions because in my mind, I knew this couldn't be true, but yet I wanted evidence to confirm that it was not true. So one of the things that I did is I got together with my friend Mike. Now, Mike was one of my buddies who was into electronics. He loved electronics. We used to have this phrase as we would build electronic devices. We would say, I'm not going to plug it in, you plug it in. I'm not going to plug it in, you plug it in. Let's get Mikey. He plugs in anything. And so we got Mikey, whose parents had bought him a Radio Shack 101 electronics kit. And he used that to fashion a project which was not part of the 101 projects the kit was designed to allow someone to develop. He built a lie detector. And of course, we had to cannibalize some components from radios and other things to complete his creation. And we decided we would meet in the library, where Thurston would have the opportunity to answer questions under the influence of a polygraph test. It was a madhouse. Students who had heard of this claim they all joined us in the library, and people were standing around as Mike and I are looking very important, sitting next to Thurston and hooking the electrodes to his finger and to his arm, and we were ready. So the first thing I was told to do, Mike said, okay, ask him a question, and then I'll flip this switch. I asked the question, and Mike flipped the switch, and Thurston received a fairly significant electric shock. And he jumped from his seat, and the crowd interpreted his response as clearly Thurston was lying. And so what happened next, I'm ashamed of and I'm saddened by. Because Thurston, who was not really meaning anyone any ill, was taken outside the library and roughed up pretty significantly. And I talked to him later, and he was crying. And I think looking back at it, Thurston simply, he wanted to live a dream. And I understand that, because that dream tugged at my heart as well. Another world, a brighter world, a better opportunity, something other than what we see here. There was an internal desire for such a thing. And so things blew over. Life went back to normal. Thurston recovered, and there was no more talk of being from another world. Now, it was 4 years later was the next time that I was introduced to someone who claimed they were from another world. And I want to tell you how that came about. One day I came home from school, and there was nobody in the house. And it was a fall day, and I went in the house, and I sat in the chair, and I was bored, and I started thumbing through the magazine rack that was next to me. And down at the bottom of it, I found this old book. And I hadn't really noticed this book before. And so I pulled this book out, and I noticed that on the cover of the book, which was all dusty and kind of bent up a little bit because everything had been piled on top of it, I noticed these two words: Holy Bible. I thought, what could that be? So I pulled the book out and I opened it, and I noticed that it was divided into two sections. There was an Old Testament and a New Testament. And so, because I liked science fiction, I figured the New Testament was probably about the future and may actually involve some science fiction. And I distinctly remember that day when I began reading in this book called the Holy Bible, in the section called the New Testament, the first chapter in something called the Gospel according to St. Matthew. And as I read these words: this is the genealogy of the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And I'm like, okay, whoever that is. And I began reading, and what follows is this genealogy, which is a series of what to me were virtually unpronounceable names. And as I read, I thought to myself, well, clearly, if this is what this book is like, it's no wonder that nobody reads it. So I kept kind of reading through there until I got to verse 18 of chapter 1. And I read these words, which changed my life. It says, "This is how the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, came about." I paused at that, and I thought to myself, he's a real guy? Because you see, I knew the name Jesus Christ. I used it a lot. But to me, Jesus Christ was kind of a vegetarian swear word. And I had no idea that it was actually connected to a person. And so that really piqued my interest. This is how the birth of Jesus came about, and he's the Messiah. And as I continued reading, very quickly, my life was irrevocably changed. Because as I went over the next couple of pages where it describes his birth, and it talks about some guy named John the Baptist, and then Jesus's baptism, and then in chapter 5, what is presented, which I now know is called the Sermon on the Mount. But to me, this person who claims to be from another world presents a picture of reality which was diametrically opposed to the reality that I understood as a regular person who had no concept of God whatsoever. And so this Jesus person, he talked about murder and how murder is not just the physical killing of someone, but it actually starts in your feelings deep in your heart. And harboring ill will towards someone is tantamount to committing murder. He talked about adultery. I knew what that was, and I thought it simply referred to sex. But Jesus talks about how really adultery is something that goes far deeper into the state of the heart, where your thoughts are, where your desires are. He talked about violence and an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which is what I was pretty well acquainted with. And he talks about instead the importance of loving your enemies and blessing those who despitefully use you and abuse you. He talks about caring for the needy and those who have less than you, and how it's your responsibility to care for every single human being, because that's how God treats you. He talks about laying up treasures in heaven, not investing so much in this earth, but rather that there's another world that is a better world, that ultimately it's possible for every single person to attain to. Talks about worry, which growing up in the family that I grew up in, I have to admit, there was a fair amount of worry. He talked about you don't need to worry because there's someone who will take care of you. He goes on and on. He presents this worldview that is utterly astounding. And I remember going to school the next day and talking to my friend Dan, and I said, Dan, have you ever heard of this book called the Bible and some guy named Jesus? Now, my friend Dan had heard about all this. And he said, look, if you want to be my friend, that's fine, but I don't want to hear about this stuff. But honestly, I simply could not stop talking about it, because what I was finding in this book was reaching down into what I'm going to say is an unbiased heart. I hadn't been tainted with experiences of religion and met Christians who were bad people, who claimed one thing and did another. I had no preconceptions at all. And so how I came to this book was literally with a wide open mind, listening to what this Jesus said. And I had to tell my friend Dan, I've never heard anybody speak like this. Now, similar to my friend Thurston, Jesus is making some extraordinary claims. And as you read the first 4 books of the New Testament, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you get the perspectives of 4 different individuals on who this person Jesus was. And yes, indeed, he makes extraordinary claims. He claims to be the light of the world. He claims to be the source of all life. He claims to be truth itself. He claims to be the resurrection and the life. He claims to offer every single human being on this planet the opportunity to live forever. Now, if those aren't extraordinary claims, I simply don't know what are. But as I mentioned with Thurston, with extraordinary claims, it requires extraordinary proof. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with this story or not, Maybe you're familiar with it and you kind of like, yeah, I believe it, but you haven't really thought it through. I want to tell you that there is far more evidence for the birth, the life, the death, and most importantly, the resurrection of Jesus Christ than many of us could possibly imagine. There have been people in history, such as a man named Simon Greenleaf. He is one of the founding researchers and educators from Harvard University who actually got the process of understanding evidentiary proceedings in legal proceedings. It's like a founding document. And he wrote this, it's probably the most important treatise still today, even though he wrote this sometime in the early 1800s. It's called The Treatise on the Law of Evidence. It's still used today. It's that profound. And he decided, because he was an atheist, he was going to examine the case for the resurrection of Christ and disprove it. Because in the early 1800s, when you have Darwin and uniformitarianism in geology coming out, you have this giant push toward discounting religion and relying solely on rationality. So Simon Greenleaf, he decides to take an evidentiary approach and disprove the revelation just on the weight of the evidence. And you can read his treatise online. And believe it or not, he actually came to the conclusion that the evidence is so compelling for the resurrection of Christ that it simply can't be denied. Now, you can choose not to believe it, but when you're talking about historical events, whether you're talking about a crime last week or you're talking about something that happened 2,000 years ago, all you can do, since you can't recreate it and observe it, all you can do is ask the question, can you prove this case beyond reasonable doubt? Is there enough evidence to say, I can't guarantee you it's true, but based on the evidence, I can't reasonably say it's not true? And Simon Greenleaf found exactly that. After looking at the vast array of evidence for Christ and his resurrection, he concluded, the evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of the fact that the resurrection took place. And he is not alone. There are plenty of modern scholars today who've come to the same conclusion. So ultimately, it comes down what you're going to choose to believe, but it all stands or falls on the evidence. Now, I'm not here today to try to present a comprehensive case for the resurrection of Christ and the deity of Christ and to demonstrate to you that Jesus is who he said he is. I'm not even qualified to do that. But I will recommend to you one source that's pretty comprehensive and it's pretty approachable from the layperson's standpoint. It's called The Case for Christ, and it's written by a man named Lee Strobel, who tried to do the very same thing Simon Greenleaf did. Lee Strobel's wife became a Christian. They had both been atheists, and he was so angry about it. By the way, he worked, I think it was for the Chicago Tribune, as like a nationally recognized investigative reporter. And so when his wife became a Christian, he became so angry, he decided he would review the evidence so that he could present it to her to disprove this belief in Jesus. And the book goes through all of the different scholars and experts and historians that he interviewed. And it only went to convince him that Jesus is indeed who he said he was. And this is important because Jesus is making incredible claims. Now, I want you to stop for just a second. If you don't believe in Christianity, or if you do believe in Christianity, I want you to just pause and ask yourself in this question. What if it's true? What if it's true? If it is true, it is the most amazing news in the history of the planet. Now, if it's not true, he's a crackpot and who cares? But what if it is true? Now, every single person needs to decide this for themselves. And to just rely on what a pastor says or what a college professor says or what a friend says, that's the complete wrong way to go about it. This is the kind of decision that requires your full attention. You need to look at the evidence for yourself. Set aside your preconceptions, set aside your biases, set aside your worldview, and simply ask yourself, what is the evidence? Now, if you're like most people, you won't be able to go through and sift through ancient documents and look up textual criticism and do all these other things. You'll have to rely on a variety of other sources. Now, it's true, there's a lot of stuff on YouTube that you can look up where you can see debates between leading Christian thinkers and leading atheist thinkers. You can look up a variety of things on YouTube, but you have to beware. As we know, it's on the internet. It has to be true, right? No, actually, it doesn't. So there's a lot of crazy ideas that can be presented as rational on YouTube and everywhere else, even in books. So you need to look up people who are rational and authoritative and thorough and open. And you'll find there are even atheists who will say the case for the resurrection is pretty compelling. You know, you look at the change in the disciples' behaviors. When Jesus was killed, the disciples were terrified that they were next. And yet, suddenly, after claiming that they saw him alive, they became absolutely fearless to proclaim that they saw Jesus, even if it meant torture to death. Nobody does that. And that's just a tiny bit of evidence. There's a lot of evidence that, again, you can't say, I have proven beyond all doubt that Jesus is who he said he is and that he rose from the dead. But I think if you look at the evidence, just like with Lee Strobel or Simon Greenleaf, you will find the evidence is pretty compelling, which brings me back to the question, what if it's true? What would you do if you knew that someone has conquered death and they offer this victory over death to every single person who is willing to accept it as a gift? Man, I can't think of any better gift than this. So in conclusion, one other little bit of evidence that I had, that as I have read the word from that very first day forward, is you know when something has the ring of truth. And I think of it like, for myself, I call it passing the smell test. You can smell it to determine if it's off. And when you look at this book, you will find, if you read it with an open mind, it passes the smell test. It's internally consistent. It's logical. It explains the world as it is. It explains why things seem so bad, and yet we recognize that it's so bad, and we feel that it should be very different than it is. It explains it all. And so I want to encourage you to avail yourself of this. This is a life or death question. Everything in your future is going to depend on how you relate to this person, Jesus Christ. Why don't you get to know him? You can start with any of the Gospels. I really enjoy the Gospel of John. It's a global perspective that really focuses on Jesus' deity. You can look at Matthew, which really goes through kind of a life biography of his ministry. You can start anywhere in the Gospels, and I believe you will meet someone who is both attractive and convincing, and whose worldview will satisfy the deepest desires of your heart. I'm Jim Higgins, and I appreciate that you're watching Reflections on Truth. For those of you who have subscribed to my channel, thank you so much. I appreciate it. It lets me know that what I'm sharing may indeed be of value to you. If you feel it's valuable, I'd encourage you, if you haven't subscribed, to subscribe. And if you have subscribed, share the video. My whole purpose in doing this is simply to communicate the goodness of God and our need to love one another as he demonstrates his love to us every day. So again, thank you for watching. I'm Jim Higgins, and this is Reflecting on Truth.